Good day, students. I am Therese Julian Abria, your teacher today. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of Donatello, one of the most influential artists of the early Renaissance period. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify key works and techniques of Donatello and understand their significance in the context of the Renaissance. In our previous lesson, we explored the works and techniques of Raphael, who is known for his harmonious compositions and mastery of perspective. Donatello, who came before Raphael, laid much of the groundwork for this later Renaissance artist. By studying Donatello, you will see how his pioneering techniques influenced artists like Raphael and contributed to the evolution of art during this period. We'll build on your understanding of Renaissance ideals such as humanism, naturalism, and the revival of classical themes and examine how Donatello brought these concepts to life through sculpture. You'll see how his use of perspective, attention to anatomical detail, and innovative approaches to sculpting in relief set a new standard for artistic excellence. Our goal today is to not only recognize Donatello's masterpieces, but also to grasp the techniques he used to achieve such lifelike and expressive works. This insight will deepen your appreciation of the Renaissance period as a whole and its impact on the development of Western art. But before we start our lesson, let's have our game. This game is called our But before we start our lesson, let's have our game. This game, for the instructions, you need to identify the artist and title of each painting based on given clues. This will be done in individual. Students will be given 25 seconds to name the unknown artworks, and the winner will receive 5 claps with chant. Good luck! He is known as Donatello. He was a master of sculpture in both marble and bronze. David. David is the first freestanding bronze statue in the early Renaissance and one of the famous artworks of Donatello. The next painting is the equestrian statue of Gattamelata. The equestrian statue of Gattamelata is Donatello's Gattamelata is a pioneering bronze equestrian statue of Erasmo da Narni created around 1453, celebrated for its realism and detailed anatomy, and it exemplifies Renaissance ideals of individualism and humanism. St. George, a marble statue from around 1416 portraying the saint as a confident young warrior, and it is celebrated for its dynamic stance and realistic detail, embodying Renaissance ideals of heroism and humanism. Who is Donatello di Niccolo Liveto Bardi? He is known as Donatello. He was a master of sculpture in both marble and bronze, one of the greatest of all Italian Renaissance artists. One of his famous artwork is David, a Christian statue of Gattamelata and Saint George. David is the first freestanding bronze cast statue of the Renaissance era, as well as the first nude sculpture of a male since the classical sculptors of ancient Greece.
We're in the Bargello in Florence, in an enormous vaulted room. This is a building that was used for judicial purposes. Now it's a museum, and it holds Donatello's David, one of the most important sculptures of the early Renaissance.
Important because it was the first freestanding nude sculpture since classical antiquity. Quite an achievement.
So for 1,000 years, the Christian West had looked to the soul as the place to focus. The body was seen as a path to corruption, and so it was not to be celebrated. What we're seeing here is a return to ancient Greece and Rome's love of the body, its respect for the body, which is so evident.
It really is. Donatello's looked back at ancient Greek and Roman sculpture also for the position that David is standing in, the position of contrapposto, which is a very relaxed pose where the weight is placed on one leg, the other leg is bent, and the figure has, because of contrapposto, has a sense of movement. In the Renaissance, this figure looked remarkably alive given the way that medieval sculpture had looked for so long.
It's detached from any kind of figural group or any kind of architecture, and so there really is a sense of autonomy, as if this figure could move forward of its own accord. The figure is referencing the classical in another way as well, in its very material nature. This is bronze, largely copper, with a little bit of tin added to it to give it strength, and it's actually hollow. It's created through a technique which is known as lost wax casting, which the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks before them had employed, and which had been used throughout the medieval period, but not at this scale. And it was just in the early Renaissance that artists are beginning to re-explore how to create bronze sculptures that are this large.
David is very young, and it's hard not to see a kind of sensuality in the way that David puts his hand on his hip and looks down, and the fact that he's wearing boots and a hat and is otherwise nude. There's a kind of eroticism here.
And that's especially evident if you look at
Now
the fact
it's time
that
for you
David
to
is
create
standing
your
on
own
the now
sculpture
severed
using
head of
your
Goliath.
clay.
In fact, in his
Good
right
luck
hand, he's holding
and enjoy.
Goliath's own sword, which David is
liberties and the freedoms that were so cherished by the Florentine people and had been threatened by the Duke of Milan.
On the other hand, you could say that the Medici were usurping the civic symbolism for themselves in some ways. And in fact, when the Medici were run out of town, this sculpture was actually taken to the Signoria, that is, to the town hall, and made a public sculpture. And so there is really the sense of the investment of this culture in this story.
Right, and so by having it in the Medici garden, appropriating this symbol of the city and all that was great about the city, the Medici were appropriating that for themselves.
So here in this sculpture is this embodiment of the promise of a long rule. David will grow up to be king, to have been enormously wise, and in a sense it was a perfect kind of story for the Medici to put forward as a representation not only of the city, but specifically of their own rule within the city.
Right, so they're sort of identifying themselves as the city of Florence, identifying themselves with youthfulness, with King David, and with all that's great about the Florentine Republic.
And although this is a sculpture that's about war, the symbols are clearly about David and peace, and the Medici and peace. David wears a soft hat as opposed to the helmet of war that Goliath wears. David has severed Goliath's head with Goliath's own battle-hardened sword. If you look at that sword closely, you can see that there are notches out of it. It's been in many, many battles. David needs to borrow it in order to sever that head. But in David's other hand, in his left hand, he holds a rock, presumably the rock that he used in the slingshot to actually fell the giant in the first place. But I think it's interesting that Donatello here, a sculptor, is actually portraying that rock as, in a sense, the opposing weapon to the sword. That is a material that Donatello, as a sculptor, often carves. He works in marble as often as he does in bronze, perhaps more often. And so are these, in a sense, the two weapons of the two cities, sort of the violence of Milan versus the culture of Florence?
The iconography, all of the meanings, David and what that meant to the city of Florence, the eroticism or even the homoeroticism. Art historians are not really sure about all of those meanings for the 15th century Florentine people. And some art historians have even suggested that the identification of this figure as David is not even completely secure, that it could also have been read as Mercury. And so we see it in a complicated way, and it's quite likely that the people of Florence in the 15th century saw it in a complicated way and had multiple readings of it.
It's an important reminder that art history itself is a process of trying to restore meaning and understand meaning through the lens of time. And
it is, after all, 600 years old.
That's right. But nevertheless, it is one of the great sculptures that really embodies so many of the ideals and so many of the concerns of the 15th century.
Donatello's David uses bronze casting for detailed and durable sculpture, features a contrapposto pose for naturalism, draws on classical art influences, showcases intricate drapery, and symbolizes triumph and virtue through David's confident stance and expression. David is the first freestanding bronze cast statue of the Renaissance era, as well as the first nude sculptor of a male since the classical sculptors of ancient Greece. Donatello's David uses bronze casting for detailed and durable sculpture. Donatello's Gattamelata statue employs bronze casting for detailed artistry, a contrapposto pose for naturalism, detailed reliefs of the pedestal, and symbolic elements like the entrance to the underworld to enhance its significance and realism. St. George, one of the 14 sculptors commissioned by the guilds of Florence to decorate the external niches of the Orson Michael Church.
Donatello produced this equestrian statue as a memorial in 1453. It was produced entirely in bronze. The statue depicts Erasmo Donani, a military leader who was nicknamed Gattamelata. This was one of Donatello's biggest undertakings, with the final piece produced at life size. The soldier passed away in 1443, with the statue completed around a decade later. The piece was commissioned by the Republic of Venice as a memorial to their exceptional former general commander who had led their troops with great honour and dignity. It remains in its original location in the Piazza del Santo in Padua, Italy. The main statue was produced entirely in bronze, but Donatello also achieved success in other materials such as marble, terracotta clay, and even wood. Artist Donatello used clear elements of symbolism in order to portray this military figure in the right light. Strength and confidence is projected from the way in which he saddles the impressive horse. His sword is also large and threatening. The horse raises one leg and balances its hoof on an orb, which represents military strength. A two-sided relief design was added below the main statue, and then a large column would sit beneath them both, lifting Donatello's design high into the sky. The relief has two different designs along its longest sides. One captures the Gattamelata's coat of arms, whilst the other features angels. Upon completion, the statue was immediately erected in its present position within the Piazza del Santo in Padua and remains there today. Padua hosts two UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Its botanical garden is considered to be the oldest of its type anywhere in the world. There is also the world-famous Scrovegni Chapel, whose interior was decorated by Giotto in the early 14th century.
Donatello's St. George uses marble for detailed realism, a contrapposto pose for naturalism, and includes iconographic elements like armor and pedestal reliefs depicting his dragon-slaying battle to enhance narrative and symbolism.
Donatello also creates this sculpture of St. George, also at Or Saint Michel. And here, the saintly knight stands proud with his shield. There were at one time a sword and helmet made of bronze, and you might sit there and look at it and go, well, why would there be a different material? But that's coming from the Greeks and Romans as well. They used to frequently create relief sculpture or sculpture in the round and then add elements. So the sculpture might be marble, but the elements that they add, the details, might be bronze or other metals. So this is again hearkening back to the classical tradition. Now, this is in the tradition of the use of warrior saints in medieval churches. Very, very common. In fact, here we see St. Theodore and St. George at Chartres Cathedral. Now, directly below our friend St. George is going to be this sculpture of St. George and the dragon. And this was commissioned 2 years after the sculpture was installed. It's actually really interesting for one particular element. It's an early attempt to add atmospheric perspective in sculpture. It's not something that we tend to see. Now, atmospheric perspective is the effect you get when you walk, when faraway objects take on sort of an atmospheric haze. Think of when you're on the freeway and you're driving along and the hills in the distance are light blue, and then they get a little darker blue, and then they're kind of light green, and then they get darker green, and then you can see branches and squirrels, and you realize you're driving up a hill. Same idea. Here, what he's done to add atmospheric perspective, and I'm going to have to pull up my pen to do this, is you'll notice things in the distant background are just barely etched in, like this tree right here, or the mountains and hills in the background, whereas things in the foreground, for example, our damsel in distress, the horse, the dragon, etc., are much closer. And even the horse, the head is moving away from us. The rear end is sort of towards us, so it's angled, falling back into the picture plane. The head is less detailed, whereas the horse's butt or rear quarters are far more in far higher relief than the rest of it. And this adds an incredible sense of depth to the sculpture. It gives us a sense of something that is incredibly realistic because it's adding an element, atmospheric perspective that we don't typically see in sculpture. But Donatello won't be the only one to do this. In fact, we're going to see it again.
Well, I've jelly for a spine and if for Ruka's head. I know it was a tease before, and when she finally falls asleep, we'll pray and say amen. Till tomorrow when it all begins.
To assess your knowledge, let's have our short quiz. This activity is called Donatello's Masterpieces Quiz and Art Match. For the instruction, you need to identify the key elements present in Donatello's artworks and match each artwork with its corresponding description, showcasing your knowledge of Donatello's style and themes. Works and techniques of Donatello, focusing on his unique approach to sculpture and how he brought his subjects to life. Remember, Donatello's attention to detail and mastery of form were revolutionary during his time. As you continue to study his work, consider how his techniques influenced the Renaissance and how you can apply similar principles in your own creative projects. Great job today, and I look forward to seeing how you cooperate these techniques in your upcoming exercises.